All right, I think it looks like, wow, it's a pretty full room. I'm so delighted that there are so many people here interested in Blender and who hopefully already love Blender. But yeah, all right, let me start a timer here so that I don't ramble forever, and then I'll dive in. Okay. So hello, thank you all for being here. I'm Greg Lord. I'm a huge Blender fanatic, as you will discover over the course of all of this. I've been using Blender forever. I am a member of MAGFest's theme team, so a lot of this is going to be geared towards like very recent memories of using Blender for all sorts of weird things that you'll probably see in the halls all over the place. So just kind of going like free form here. I have a lot of stuff to go through, probably way too much, so I'll try not to like run out of time, but I did want to say like I can ramble forever, so if anybody has a question, please interrupt, like raise a hand. I will try to go through these whenever. We can definitely do questions at the end too. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of dive on in here. This is Blender for artists and developers, which I think are the two sort of companies I keep in friend groups and things, all trying to figure out this wacky thing called Blender. So yeah, Pango here, our mascot this year, was modeled in Blender, as he's saying. And this is, of course, because Greg uses Blender for basically everything. And you know, whether or not I should use Blender for those things is always an interesting question. But you can too. So we'll see how everyone likes Blender. But just kidding, because you should use Blender for everything. All right, so what are we talking about when we say Blender? Well, obviously, we're going to dive into the world of fruit smoothies and, okay, yeah, no. No, I won't. I will never stop using that joke. All right, my credentials begin and end with I am currently wearing Blender socks. This is true. I thought, you know, I can like try to do the contortion thing. Yeah. Which, well, all right, that's how you begin on a high note. That's it, folks. You've been a great crowd. Thank you. Blender socks. So my feet have been UV unwrapped for any of you who already knows what that means. If you don't know what that means, we will talk about what that means. But yeah, it scares me to say, and it's a number I don't want anyone to think too much about. But yeah, I've been using Blender for more than 20 years now. It's not always been the beautiful thing it is today, so some of that was easier than others. Socks, not quite so old, but yes, that's a relatively recent development. Actually, I am, yeah, that's me, that's my Discord. I am part of MAGFest theme team, I said, so basically some of the artwork, some of the assets, the animations, the signs, the posters, everything that you'll see, a lot of that goes through Blender in my pipeline. The other main thing for MAGFest that I started with MAGFest doing was our VR chat department. So out in the promo area, if you noticed a big 3-screen VR portal where we have two-way communications back and forth with VR chat, specifically in a version of the Gaylord that we modeled years ago and adapt every year for our theme to be the sort of like themed version of our actual space for virtual participants. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Blender, 100% for all of the production, for all of that for me. That also goes into Unity, the game engine, and VR chat specifically, the sort of tooling on top of Unity. But that's, we can talk about that as much as anyone is interested to. Blender is the part that I want to definitely emphasize there. This year also MAGFest Power Magazine, just shout out if you're looking for something to read. We've got a crazy new magazine project. And then yeah, day job, I am an administrator at Northeastern University, managing programs there. I try to use Blender a lot for that stuff. It's more MAGFest than day job for me, but yeah. So what is Blender? This is some footage I thought to sort of just run in OBS while I was modeling the very first thing I ever did for MAGFest, which was just the very beginning stages of taking some reference photos of the atrium and starting to lay out very basic block models of like, hey, we should model the Gaylord because it's a pandemic year and nobody can be there in person. So very much a pandemic project, labor of love, like I just missed the place, so it's felt like time to try to model it, and Blender is my best friend there. So Yeah, that's Blender on the right there. 3D modeling software is the short way to say it. There's a million different things that you could sort of dive into further, but importantly, it is free. It is open source software. And really any platform that you already like to use, it probably works on that platform, which is great. Other 3D software has real limitations in these ways. So I started to say, a normal day in the life for me might be modeling characters, modeling things for our animations. You'll see a lot of our mascots here. This is Dr. Garbotnik, our villain of the year, whose attire I'm currently wearing in addition to Blender socks here. So yeah, he's one of our anti-heroes modeled in Blender. Okay, we're going to play a game also with this presentation called Things That PowerPoint Suggested to Me as the Alt Text of Images. And I was particularly happy with cartoon character in a trash can. So wherever those amused me, I threw them in. But yeah, okay, what can Blender do? We're going to start just kind of with what it is, and I'll start showing stuff here as we get into it. Blender, specifically if you're familiar with different types of 3D modeling, is polygon modeling. This means you're basically laying out shapes in the form of like polygonal models. That is, I would say, its core feature. It is also an incredibly capable animation software for a bunch of different things. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of animation as animation, but also animation as sort of a pipeline into like game development. I try to do a little bit of both. It is a renderer. It has actually multiple different renderers that you can use. So if you're trying to make something that is being animated out to be sort of a short film or something, you can definitely use Blender for that in a couple of different ways. It is sculpture software, so there are definitely commercial products that might be sort of more industry standard. If anyone's heard of ZBrush, I would say those are great tools if you have them, if you can afford them, if you can get a license for them in other ways. They're expensive. Blender is actually a great sculpture software, and it's what I use on purpose even with a ZBrush license. And then I'm putting an asterisk next to this one, 3D printing. Definitely you can make models that will go to 3D print as an STL, and that will work. If you're trying to do very precise 3D printing, that's where I feel like you could start to wiggle away from Blender into other things, and be sad about wiggling away from Blender. But also, as we talk about game dev, basically the idea that you are making the assets that will then sort of go into the game engine of your choice. So whether that's Unity or Unreal Engine or Godot or whatever, you can make things that will export and then import to those game engines, and you're on your way. So this is a quick look at our VR chat world. This is the VR Maglord, as we call it. So this is as many MAGFest memes as we can shove in there. I realize it's really dark on this projector, but yeah, that's the Rocking Bay, which is the sci-fi version of the concert hall. Our VR portal there in its first year. This is actually a couple years old, so it's even newer and shinier here, but this is the sort of trailer we made out of it. And you know, the lower atrium in the real world, sadly, is not an 80-foot fountain of King Donut, which it certainly should be, but it is in ours. So the idea of having the sort of creative freedom with a tool like that to just put together a space entirely of one's making and iterate on it every year and sort of shove more and more jokes and more theme pieces into it is the magical world of that sort of modeling projects. And I would say, you know, Unity is definitely the game engine. VR Chat is definitely the sort of toolkit that you're using for a project like that. But all of the creative side of that is Blender. Like that's whether you're doing it as one big holistic model or a lot of little models that you're sort of assembling in your game engine. That's very much the sort of pipeline for these things. So again, I mean to keep this more focused on Blender, but I want to sort of talk about like those like pipelines as we go through all of this. So by now you love Blender and you want to, oh, it's just going to do that one again. That's cool. You want to get into using Blender, and so you should. And where do you get Blender? Well, you would go to blender.org/download, and you would ask yourself, well, what operating systems are supported? And the answer is yes. So it is, okay, and you know, there are different versions of Blender. What version should you get? This is actually a good question if you really know a lot about Blender and different things that have changed over the years, but honestly, just get the latest one. It is totally fine. And if you need specific things from other years or other versions, you can even have several of them at a time. And the sad way that I know this is because I have 5 installed currently. You will not need 5. I would say if you're dealing with old legacy projects that do or don't perform better in certain versions, you might need more than one, but yeah. And if you're really impatient and you watch all the cool YouTube videos about the next upcoming features in Blender, you can go get nightly builds and you can get all the cool new features that people are showing in those, and it's great, except that they break a lot. So you might also want to be patient and wait for them to be part of a stable release, but it's all good either way. Like I said, you can have more than one. So we get philosophical here and we say, why Blender? There are a lot of good ways to do these sorts of things, 3D modeling, game development, like plenty of tools, and everyone has strong preferences about their tools. But I would say, if we're starting on just a very practical note, it is free. This means like if you're just diving into 3D modeling and you just want to play, like there is absolutely no drawback to just going and playing in Blender. To compare against that, there are things like, people will argue that something like Maya, well, that's the industry standard, and maybe that's where people should start. And I would say, that's great, except that other modeling things are, they are less free. So I see price tags like that. And I will say I come from an education world here, my sort of day job. I've worked with a lot of students who are getting into this stuff, and I would say that in good conscience, I would say it's nice to sort of prepare somebody with something that they can keep forever. And if someone outgrows those things for other reasons and needs to get into particular software, great. But yeah, that number scares me, as does it scare Sonic. Oh, our alt text for this one, Paramount Pictures revives Ugly Sonic. I guess that was when they made the other movie that he was in. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so, and you might think, okay, well, there are other ways to pay for these other softwares, and there are. There's this weird flex thing for Maya with these tokens, and you can get tokens for $300, and they're weird to me, and you can use them for 24 hours to spend one token and stop using your software to use another token, and track tokens with account. I don't know. I don't know. There's something about open source that sounds really appealing versus that. But all of that is I think that's the cynical take, is to just look at the price tag. I would say the other reason is just because Blender is awesome. You can do so many things with it, and I think that is plenty of reason to be excited enough about it without sort of needing to compare it to things. This is, as I was saying, every year our sort of VR chat world is themed. This is our Pango and Dr. Garbotnik theme this year, which might remind you of video games that you may have seen in the past, hopefully. Yeah, so that is Donut Hill Zone, as I have been calling it. But yeah, it's a blast. Definitely come see the portal in the promo area if you haven't. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, once again, entirely made in Blender. This is alt text. A video game scene with a roller coaster. We do not have a roller coaster, but it's a nice thought. We do have that corkscrew, which I guess it thought was a roller coaster. Okay, so Blender on its own merits. So forgetting that we're trying to compare it to things on price and all of that, it really does do just about everything you could ask out of a 3D application. Like I said, like animation and rendering and sculpture and all of these sorts of things. You can use it as a video editor, and I have on purpose. It runs on just about anything. If you have that old computer in your closet, it will run Blender fine. I would say certainly there will be things that you will run into as technical limitations, but and there is a huge Blender community. I think this is one of the biggest things by itself. Like, there are people out there answering your questions if you're searching for them, and tons of YouTube channels that will happily show you this or that tutorial. So that is big for me. That is, all of this, I think for everyone that does this, is a little bit self-taught, if not entirely self-taught. So I feel like framing it in that way of where can I sort of answer my questions, or where can I sort of start as a learning place, this is a very strong community. And yeah, Blender is very customizable. I'll talk more about that in a minute, though. Okay, but you're not there just to model. You're there to make games, maybe. Actually, you know what? I would love to poll the room. Who here is wanting to do 3D modeling but has never done it at all? That is most of the room. That's awesome. Okay. And how about people that like already do 3D modeling but either don't use Blender or like, okay, that's a fair few people too. Can people like shout out, like, what do you use? Like, okay. Fusion, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so this is interesting because people are coming from sort of different like modeling paradigms, I would say, like when we're talking about fusion and things like that. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Definitely those things have their own sort of niche as well, and not niche, like an entire field of modeling. But yeah, so part of that, the last thing I was gonna ask the room, I guess, is just like, who is here specifically because you want to make games with tools like this? All right, see, that's actually a lot of people. Okay, cool. So I have at least a little bit worked with all three of these game engines and used Blender to get things in and out of them and had no real troubles other than that first sort of day of like head scratching, figuring out what is different from one to the other. I do use Unity all the time. Unity is the game engine upon which VR Chat runs. Our whole big project is basically centered on Unity as our, the last 10 years of trying to make like indie games and things in that. Things have changed a lot with these engines if anyone stays up on the news with all of these. So, things like Godot are a nice thing to have too, but yeah. I like to say, like the question, okay, can Blender do? Yes, that is my answer. And then I will add the asterisk. So like probably, yes. And here, my general take when people ask me about this is just like, you'd go and download it. It's like a 300 meg download. It installs on the computer that you forgot you had in your closet, and it is easy to kick around and watch YouTube tutorials for. Like, you lose nothing to try. So I would say like use Blender basically like until you are sure that you can't. And if you are sure that you can't, it's because maybe there are things that people have added as Blender add-ons. So we get into the wacky world of Blender add-ons here. There's a huge site called Blender Market that has been getting bigger every year. Blender Market is basically, and this is where it starts to turn into paid things. So we leave the free paradigm here upon this particular mark. But Blender Market is sort of indie add-on developers. Many of these things are free, but there is a whole range of paid add-ons for Blender that basically I would look at as ways to fill in the gaps of things that either doesn't do as easily as it could or things that it doesn't do at all. Blender themselves have a page called extensions.blender.org. It's the same idea, and they are all free. It is a much, much smaller list, probably because I think it only offers things that are free. And yeah, basically think of these as add-ons that simplify things or that add features that Blender doesn't have. Some examples, just as a very quick slide here, like I think the most popular tools are, this is what's on the home page as the like popular items this week or whatever. Like Auto Rig Pro is a thing to help you set up a model to animate, and it's probably a lot simpler. I don't really use it. Hard Ops is a thing if you're modeling like mechanical things with a particular style. Blender can do it, but maybe this makes it easier. And things like this Botanic are like a library of like plants and trees and things. Maybe you don't want to model every tree in a world that you're doing. That's not the point, but this could be the thing that puts it into Blender for you, etc. So things like that are a good way to sort of round out the like, well, what does Blender not do out of the box? And then this is where I will confess things that I do use other tools for in this world, but we're not telling Blender about this. So I'm going to cover the part of my computer that has Blender installed so it can't hear me. The parametric 3D modeling, this is where we're talking about like CAD and things. So if you are trying to make something like very precise thresholds for 3D printing that's going to be like an interactive thing. My example of this, if anybody's gotten a Swag the last 2 years at the merch booth and you see the Swag shell, this is an injection molded plastic shell that protects your Swag and sits around it and makes it pretty. For the last 2 years we've done this. I've used Blender for a lot of the blockout for the models for those, but when it came time to actually do the design work on these, that was members of the Swag team here. Eric, I think, is here, and and Emily, one of the heads of the Swag team, modeling the very precise parts of it that are functional and then letting me play with like little designs on top of it. For that, I would use a tool called Plasticity. It is modeled after Blender, it interacts with Blender great, useful for people like me that don't really know Fusion. If we're doing really complex models, so our gazebo this year in the VR chat world is the little capsules from the Sonic games. And something that's really material heavy like that, I will use Substance Painter, which is now an Adobe tool. And then just when we're making graphics, like the little designs on the walls and things, that's just normal graphic design workflow for me. I would use Illustrator or Photoshop or something, and then just take those in as textures into Blender, which I think that's pretty normal, but like just to mention that there are other tools involved in these things. You can texture paint in Blender just fine if you're into that sort of style of things, like making like painterly style graphics or whatever. I wouldn't use it for making very precise like graphic design assets, but yeah. Okay, our alt text for this slide, a computer screenshot of a video game, which it isn't, but I'm glad that it thinks so when it sees my Blender screenshot. All right, and then the drawbacks, there are a few. People really, you probably know people, maybe you are people, that think Blender is hard and would advise you not to use Blender because it's hard. This is my visualization of the learning curve of Blender, which is a vertical wall with spikes below it. Yeah, I don't know. I would say it's not that hard. The other drawbacks, there are tools like Maya does have integrated pipelines back and forth with the game engine if that's what you're interested in doing. I think they're sort of built in. Blender, it's a little bit more sort of figure it out, but this is where I say the community has figured these things out. And then it is a jack of all trades, which means that if you're looking at one specific feature, let's use sculpture as the example. Like if you really just want to sculpt, maybe ZBrush is the more powerful tool, and that's fine. But like if you also want to sculpt and then make a polygon model on top of your sculpture to make sure that it's efficient for using in a video game or something, like you could do all of that inside Blender. If these are terms that you don't know, I'll show some examples of this as we get into it. But yeah. Things you would need. A mouse is my one and only thing. I think you need a mouse to use Blender. I've tried it on a trackpad and it makes me very sad. You need this specific Sonic mouse. I'm sorry to say, you just good luck finding it, but if one person buys this mouse because of this presentation, it will all have been worth it. I love this mouse. A computer, I'm saying of potato quality or better. Honestly, you might want more than that, but yeah. And then hard drive space, if you're getting into big models, if you're getting into rendering videos and all of that, like just, be on a computer that has some hard drive space. It eats it very happily. Those are the needs. I would say the nice to haves. A full keyboard. Blender uses numpads for a lot of very heavy things. I don't have a full keyboard when I'm on my laptop, but I do have one of these ridiculous mice that's like an MMO mouse with like 12 buttons on the side. This is my numpad that muscle memory has turned into being not so bad to use. But yeah, it's I'm not saying you need that, but a keyboard's nice. A big monitor. It's the interface gets very full very quickly. Maybe another monitor, and of course a good graphics card doesn't hurt. I mentioned before, like I use Adobe Creative Cloud stuff like Illustrator and InDesign or in Illustrator. Those are nice to use for those graphics things. And then the very nice to haves, if you're into sculpture, a graphics tablet. So actually being able to sculpt with a gestural sort of pen control. And boy, it really doesn't like me clicking next here. A gaming tier, let's just call it like gaming specs for if you're really getting into like intense 3D models that are animating and sculpting and rendering and all of that, you probably want something that could run a good game. But more than any of those things, just philosophically, you want time and you want patience. It does take a minute, and I would say once you get over that like sort of click moment, like you will become a person that buys Blender socks and then tells people about it. So if that sounds like a cult, I will accept the criticism. All right, so what I use Blender for, this is the sort of show and tell portion of like Blender, things made in Blender. So our theme team stuff, this is our character last year. We did a Metroid Prime theme, which meant that we had very like complex sort of like 3D model characters for everything. Metroid Prime was the 3D game in the series, or the first 3D game in the series, so it was very 3D heavy year. This year, things like the character designs for Dr. Garbotnik and Pango, and the little like Sonic 2 tunnel mini games and all of that is just little flair. The characters, to be like our cute little title screens and things. This is where I think it gets into sort of workflows. Like some of this is the kind of game-ready thing where we just have sort of an animation of Pango running, and like you could shove that into a game engine, and that would be your run animation that then the game engine is controlling it playing. That's that sort of game development animation workflow. Whereas if you're trying to compose a full scene, you might get into more sort of cinematic things where you're like actually animating a camera and putting special effects in the background and having little animations on top of animations, like the little spinning signpost. This was part of our teaser for this year that we put out for the sort of first type of like, hey, this is our theme. And then lastly, this is me using Blender as a video editor. We had this sort of animated Sonic Mania trailer where we had like, there's a scene in the Sonic Mania trailer where he's like running through this sort of space and there are these shapes flying past, but that's our excuse to make those shapes into actually videos that are playing within Blender, so you can adjust all the timings and everything to make sure that like the video is playing at the right spot when he's running past or when it's scrolling past and all of that. And then there are like music visualizers built into the program like that Blender is running. You can do scripting in Blender, so these are like live graphic EQs for the audio and all of that. And yeah, this was modeled in Microsoft Excel for reals. The last several slides kept saying modeled in Blender, and it's like, well, yeah, that's probably why it's here. So yeah, Excel. Again, I was saying last year, the 3D theme, like being able to make like, it's weird for me to do a logo in a 3D modeling software, but there are times that it makes perfect sense. That theme last year, like it was a very 3D logo. So guess what? That's how we did the logo last year. It was a 3D model that was rendered down to like a PNG. And then, as I said, this year's like some of it was character driven and all of that. The weirder ones that I think maybe like using it as a graphic designer, I think are not so obvious. So if you've seen the map this year, I hope everybody likes the map. The fun thing about the map was it's just a Blender file. So this is. If you all know the Boundary Break series on YouTube, this is your sort of like, look how broken it looks once you turn the camera moment. You render to the camera, or you arrange to the camera. But yeah, that's the map once one gets behind the scenes there. So yeah, the advantage to that, like modeled in Blender, it would be weird if it wasn't. But yeah, it's actually kind of nice to lay it out that way and to be able to rearrange things and to like connect things up with like these little, silly assets like the little tunnels and the water slides and all of that. Like theming it feels fun, where if it was all an illustration, I feel like you could potentially be like more constrained about making edits once you've started to lay things down. So it's actually kind of functional too. Things like Garbotnik, once he was modeled, you can start to use him for other things, such as the staff badge. So if you've seen the staff badge this year, that's where that came from. And but seriously, try Blender. So the staff badge is telling you to try Blender. Who are we to argue? And the reason for that just being, some of the character poses, art references. You can pose a thing that's already rigged in a quick way and then sort of like create artwork based on that as reference. Also, sometimes it's hard to draw things that are mechanical or hard surface, like his trash pod is a little bit weirder to draw than like an organic like character. So rendering those out in different angles was sometimes useful for the artwork. I mentioned the swag shell. This is last year's where we were using Blender, at least for the block out of this. It was parametric modeling, like I said. This year's is the polyphonic the swag dog was the name. I don't know if that ever stuck. I think that's my fault, and I would love for people to start using it so that it becomes canonical. But yeah. And then a weird one, the book. Last year, actually laid it out in Blender just to sort of imagine what the physical thing would look like once it was produced. I wouldn't think to use Blender for book design, but it was super useful as like a mock-up thing. And we made a book again this year too. If anyone's interested in a 100 pages behind the scenes look at MAGFest. And yeah, it's available at the Birch. No, this is not a shameless plug because I am deeply ashamed. Yeah, anyway, the world I showed a minute of earlier. And yeah, I figured with the time that we have here, oh, this is Donut Hill Zone, yeah. And okay, the workflow for this, Blender into Unity, which is where VR Chat lives, and the tools that VR Chat will use to get it into our sort of VR world. But yeah, so, Unity's logo, the alt text was shape. So take that as you will, as maybe an indictment of graphic design. I don't know. It's not a bad logo. Okay, so we're going to actually get into Blender now here. Questions before I do that, if anyone has anything. Excuse to drink water.
I'm curious, those VR Chat maps you did, are those like archived anywhere?
I couldn't really hear you.
VR Chat maps, are they archived?
Are they what?
Archived.
I still can't hear you.
Archived?
Yeah. So every year we basically add a new world, and the old ones are still available. Those are not like the public link that we would give out, but yeah. So sure, yeah, we can sort of come on over and talk, and we can show you some of the old ones or get people to them. Yeah. Questions? All right, let's get into it. So as I start to show you Blender, there's an important character you must meet. It is the default cube. One opens Blender, and there is a cube sitting in the scene. He is to be respected. The reason I say this is because the normal thing is to open Blender, delete the default cube, because that's just what you do. But you need a cube, so you add a cube to start working. We honor the default cube with the ceremonial garb of other Blender apparel. Okay. So I thought I'd show just some quick Blender, like the very, very basics of what its interface looks like, what the sort of basic operations are. So we'll move over to that. I guess I have to like end presentation. Let me do that. And then hopefully you are seeing Blender, yeah? Okay, cool. So this is default cube. We love default cube. And so we delete default cube. And all right, so yeah, no, I know, believe me, I'm as unhappy about it as you are. And actually, you know what? I have a scene set up for this, so we'll start from my scene that's just got a couple more things prepared. So spinning wheel, that's a good sign. Okay, so here's our same scene, default cube, all of that. Spinning wheel is also a good sign. I'll say I don't normally work off of a laptop or this laptop, so I'm hoping all of this behaves itself. So how's everyone doing? Boy, was it forced quit already? Are we in that part of the presentation? I think it's forced quit. I love it. I've given this talk for the last few years, and I've had at least one like major problem each time. So we'll see if maybe we land on like moderate problem this year.
Because you're not using the Sonic mouse?
That's true. That's it. I'm not using the Sonic mouse. I've specifically warned even myself. All right, so scene, default cube, all of that good stuff. So we'll delete the default cube. And it's scathing indictment of that. Okay. So we need a cube, so let's add a cube. And so I figured I would show just the very, very, very basics. Blender, this is going to be true of any 3D modeling, but just for anyone who's brand new, there are basically two modes in Blender. I would say this is the most central paradigm. There is object mode, which is just you have your model and you can move it around, you can make it bigger or smaller, you can tell it where to be, but you're not like changing the shape of it. That is object mode. There is also edit mode, which is where you are changing the shape of it, and you can get in and actually start like moving vertices around and making it into whatever shape you want. So in either of those modes, what you're doing is basically just making the shape, you're changing it based on sort of certain operators. There is G for grab, which is just you pick it up and move it around. That's G. There is S for scale. You're scaling it. And then there is R for rotate, and it will rotate. If you basically draw a line from your eyeballs to the middle of the screen, it will rotate it around that. But maybe you don't want to rotate it around that because that's weird. You want to rotate it a particular way. So if you look, Blender will show you the axes here. You've got your little previewer here. So this red X up here, our red line is our X axis. Our Y line is our green line there. And then it doesn't render it, but blue is the up and down Z axis. So I say that to say, like, let's say you were rotating this, but you want it to rotate basically this way around our red X axis. As we would rotate, we would just hit X. And now it will constrain it to that, and we can rotate it just that way. Same again, I could hit Y, and it would do it that way, or Z, and it would do it that way. So let's do the same thing. We'll grab, and we'll just constrain it to Z. We'll kind of move it down a little bit. We can scale, and you can lock an axis too and do just the opposite, where instead of constraining it to one, you're saying everything but one axis. So I'm going to hit Shift Z, and now you'll see it gets sort of wider but not taller, because I'm saying don't change Z. So that's our little cube there. We'll get him out of the way, and I'll hide that. You can have a number of primitives that you start with. I'd say any modeling thing is a matter of like, what shape can I start with that's the most similar to what I'm trying to make. So let's use a circle, for example. We've got our circle here. Right now, it's just edges and vertices, but you can turn that into a shape with the F key, which is up here, I think, in new edge face from vertices. So we're taking that, and now we're making a shape, but we want it to be a solid shape. So I can hit E for extrude, and it will basically sort of duplicate in a way that's connecting everything up to make a solid shape. So this is our new cylinder that we've made, starting from an unconnected circle into a filled-in cylinder. So that's that. If we want to sort of think about how to change edges or change vertices, we can also start to do operations on those. So Control B gives us our bevel, where we can start to sort of pull those away and make like a little chamfer here, or with our mouse wheel, round that off by making more and more. You can do that on multiple things at a time. So if we did that to both edges here, so let's take this, and then do our Control B bevel. Now we can make sort of this like rounded shape here. And that's kind of cool, except that it looks kind of like a disco ball with this like really flat shading. So we want to come in here and maybe not make it so faceted. You might want that if you're modeling like furniture where you want really hard edges, but we're going to shade it smooth, and now it sort of lights it as if it's a smooth contour. So there's our cylinder now for our next thing. We can scale this the same way. If you want to duplicate something that you've already made, you can Shift D to duplicate that thing, and whatever you duplicate, you can then sort of edit. You can do that to your heart's content and keep doing that. You can take another one, and like I said, you can constrain to another axis, so I'm going to do that to keep the Z the same, or specifically model the Z and all of that. So there's that. I'll hide all of these. And then we're going to make another cube. We'll fondly remember default cube for his sacrifice. But another sort of workflow there, I was talking about extrude earlier. So if we take our top face there and extrude, we can basically pull one face away, do that as many times as we want. We can pick different faces and extrude that. We can keep doing that as much as we want. So now we're making like sort of a door frame or something. And this is a sort of chance to show one of the weirder things about Blender that is actually one of the best things about Blender once you sort of get your head around it. Yeah, question?
How are you selecting the faces?
Oh, okay, that's a good thing to point out. Up here in the upper left, the question was, how am I selecting the faces? You have different selection modes. So you have select vertices, which will start to like sort of render the dots on everything where the vertices are. That's you editing a vertex at a time, so you could start to do vertex by vertex selection, or you can switch to edge select here, or you can switch to face select, and then when you click, you'll basically pick faces. That's 1, 2, and 3 keys if you leave the default key mapping. So those are things you'll use all the time. But let's say you wanted things to line up. Well, Blender has this magical thing called the 3D cursor, and it is a little bit weird, but a little bit awesome. I'm going to say a lot of bit awesome. If I click on something here and select it, this little sort of red and white checker guy down here is our 3D cursor, and we can use that to basically like make things relative to a particular point. So let's say that I wanted to move my cursor to that. I'll select this and there's a radial menu here for selection, or cursor to selected. So now I've moved my cursor up there, and I can select these guys over there and tell this operation to change to pivoting by my 3D cursor, and now I can basically like line them up directly. Like if it was up here and I wanted to move it to right there, I can just scale that down to that point. So now they're nicely aligned and all of that. So now you're back to being able to extrude or whatever you want to do. So I'll hide that. And then one more Blender character I'd love to introduce you all to. This is a model that they include by way of sort of an example of a lot of things. Meet Suzanne. Suzanne is wonderful. I am not entirely sure why her name is Suzanne, but if you have anyone in your life who is awesome who is named Suzanne, that's now you have one more. So yes, Suzanne is the monkey model that sort of demonstrates things usefully. One of the big things about Blender workflow that I would say is basically what they call modifiers. You can think of this as tools that make a lot of things a lot easier. So let's say we loved Suzanne, but we just wanted Suzanne to have bigger ears. So I could come in here in my face select mode and start to like draw a selection where I'm selecting the ears. And I have all the ear polygons selected, I think. It's a little bit tedious. And when I would come in here and scale that ear to be larger, this is the S key again, that's great. But now I'd have to come over here and do it again. And we don't want to do it again. We've done it once. We want it to just magically happen to the other side. So we have a thing called the mirror modifier. So we've got our mirror up, and it's gonna mirror it, but the thing is there's data on both halves of the center line, so it's mirroring both halves to the other half. So what we can do is basically go in and just like delete the left half of the model. So I'm gonna basically do a box select on this whole side and not do what I was trying to do. I have failed, because I still had the ear selected, so there. So now basically we have half of a model that anything I do will affect the other side. But this is annoying when we want to move something and we want to do like one at a time. Now we're no fools. We want to do this right. So they have a thing called proportional edit. It's this little guy up here. You can think of this as basically when you start to do an operation, you can make it affect more or less of the thing around that thing. So you can sort of scale whole shapes at a time like this. You'll notice that it's starting to pull away from the center, and that's weird. We can solve that by turning on this clipping thing. Which will basically mean that the center is like welded to the center. Point of this whole thing is basically like this is a way with all models, the Pango model, Dr. Garbotnik, whatever, you probably have a symmetrical model and you want what you do on one half to affect the other. This is setting it up to like save you twice the time and all the precision. Yeah.
How are you circle selecting all those spaces earlier?
Yeah, and you know, I want to say this in general too. I wish that this could be like a 3-hour thing where I can like go like detail by detail. I know an hour is no way to like learn in great detail all of these things. But to answer that, the question is circle select. It's just the C key when you're in like edit mode, and it will pull up a circle, and then you can kind of click and like paint your selection, and then when you're done, you right click to say like, okay, cool, I'm done. There are also modes where you can basically put this into, like the W key will cycle through like an inherent circle selector that just stays on. So there's lots of little modes. I'd say this is where like definitely start with YouTube videos that are gonna go like click by click detail if you wanna get into all of this, but like I'm hoping sort of showing some stuff happening is like a useful like, you know, and I can too kind of starting place. So the point of all of this was if I move Suzanne over here, maybe out of the way a little bit, and maybe unhide some of our stuff. Oops, I didn't mean to hide Blender. Sorry, new keyboard. Yeah, okay, well what are we starting to make here? So let's, wait a minute. We'll get Suzanne over here, we'll make this a little smaller, and we're gonna show our last modifier here, array, where we can make something duplicate and sequence to it. And behold, our definitely looks exactly like a MAGFest logo with a monkey. Woo! It sneaks up on you. You never know, you might accidentally model MAGFest logos. Yeah, so that's my like cheesy overview of the very, very basics. More practical things just for fun. You saw maybe the sunflower in the atrium. A workflow like that might be like that array modifier that just kind of duplicates things in a series. That might be how you'd make like a fence post. I've made one fence post, now I want 30 of them. You'd have an array, just make your other 29. But you can also do it like relative to things in ways that are actually super useful. So like, if I wanted this one little petal of this sunflower here, this doesn't look much like a sunflower right now, I can create what's called an empty, which is just sort of a point in space that will visualize itself. And I can tell this petal I want to do an array. So I'm flipping on an array modifier, and you'll see by default it'll do what the last one did, which is just kind of put it beside itself for as many times as I say. But instead of being in a line, I want to make it relative to an object. So this is called object offset, and I'm going to tell it relative to that empty that we just made. Doesn't look like anything happened because the thing's in the same spot, but as I would start to rotate this, if I've done this correctly, what it should do is like duplicate as the rotation of that empty move. So now I'm rotating that thing 45 degrees, and it knows to turn it 45 degrees. Nice reason to do it this way is now I can tell it to go ahead and make 8 of these, and I've made my sunflower. Well, I've made half of my sunflower. This is where we can start to pair these. I think this is a useful example of like using mirror and that. Mirror doesn't look like it did anything because the X part is already symmetrical. You get to pick your axes, so I'll turn that to mirroring along the Y instead. And behold, our sonic sunflower. That's using arrays in conjunction with one another. Yeah?
Do you have like a website or anything you go to just to remind yourself of the hotkeys?
Yeah, Blender themselves have hotkeys online, but I would say honestly, like, download like some cheat sheet like that will just have it all on one like PDF. Like physically print it and have it next to you. I would never do that for anything, but like that is what I will do all the time is just consult those. Eventually, hotkeys are like the nature of Blender, and one thing you'll hear a lot of Blender evangelist types say is that like, well, Blender is so fast, and that's really, really true because it has the most arcane hotkeys that like, I think were designed because when you use them as muscle memory, they really are a very fast workflow, but like they have nothing to do with other applications. Like Control-C, Control-V is like used a couple places in Blender. Otherwise, like if we're duplicating something, we're not Control-C, Control-Ving it, we're Shift-D. Like you have no way of actually guessing these things intuitively, but like I would say, just force yourself over the hurdle and the hotkeys will actually feel great. I don't know, it's a... Vim is a great Vim is a great comparison. Anybody who's had the pleasure of Vim. I say this as a hypocrite because I never could get over the Vim thing and was like, this is too weird for me. I use VS Code for what that tells you about me. Okay, so those are my examples of modifiers. Modifiers are great. You'll use them all the time. That's the nature of things. If you're doing visual work, you're probably trying to apply materials and things. This is great. These have all been gray shapes so far. They're not the most beautiful things to look at. So examples of some of these things that I would give. Oh, and very briefly, I just wanted to show this again. I don't even need to blow this up. This is what I was showing at the beginning. You can put images as a background and basically start to model over top of those. So this idea of modeling, the Gaylord, that was basically because they have blueprints that, they're not scale accurate, but they're close enough that I put down as a background in Blender and just basically started to model over, and you get the beginnings of your shape, and then eventually you don't need the image anymore. But like that's probably the way to work on a great many things, is to start to do your modeling with an image in the background. My favorite of all time is this thing. If we're talking about what textures do, you'll maybe be familiar with UV maps. This is basically the image on the right is basically what the model will show by way of like where the particular polygons lay as flat things over top of that. This can be confusing. What's less confusing is the example of the Santa Claus chocolate. This was one of these things that was shown to me early career with like how to intuitively understand what a UV map is. So eventually you're dealing with images that you're going to be laying over these. I was going to show a quick example of this from our magazine this year. We like to make fake ads. So this is our MAGFest energy drink called Blam, not to be confused with any commercial energy drinks, featuring stupid flavors such as Ocarina of Lime, Skyward Strawberry, and Majorly Mango. So yeah, this is obviously a Blender model in the background, which is great. And I use this as my example of UV mapping at my professionalism's peril. But yeah, so this is a very, very simple scene. It is just a rectangle with 4 little cylinders that have fancier little tops on them. But when you kick this into a rendered view and put the camera at an interesting angle and put literally a still image of a forest in the background, this is a flat picture of a forest. You can compose something that more or less looks like a magazine ad with a clever light or two. These cans, simplest model in the world really, but you'll see down here this is basically what is being overlaid on top of them. So if I go into my UV editing mode, you'll basically see the if I actually went into my UV editor, this is where those shapes lay. Oh, boy, I would have kept going for the entire rest of my time. Let's try that again. All right, hopefully, yeah, here you go. This is my scene in all of its majesty here. It is 4 cylinders on top of a rectangle and a still image of the forest in the background. Not much to it, but you move the camera and hey, it looks okay. And yeah, what I was saying was basically this is where the UVs are on top of that. So you can sort of see, like, make this in an Illustrator and then, take a photo of the top of a can and just tell, this portion of the model to use this portion of the image or whatever. That's UV mapping in 1 minute. I was really hoping to get into some animation. I have just a couple minutes left. I'm happy to do questions here. I don't mean to run out of time. Does anybody have questions so far? Or I can show an animation example too. Okay, animation it is. Yay, okay, so let's open. We've got Pango. Pango is already set up with a rig. I swear I thought I was going to have enough time to do a speed model of King Donut, so if anybody's interested, we can hang out. We're here for 4 days. I will happily model with anybody. This is Pango, our model, the actual one that we use. It's rigged already, which means that it has a sort of armature, it's called. It's the series of skeletal bones that will tell this how to move. Quick example of that is basically I'm going to pick his hand bone here, and you'll see that as I move this around, it has what's called an inverse kinematic chain to be able to connect back to his shoulder, shoulder as if he has a shoulder, and move that around. The example I was going to say is just basically if you come into your animation view and just start to lay down what are called keyframes, I can tell his foot to be here on frame 1, and then I can go forward to, let's say, frame 10, and move it up here, and I guess I should rotate it, and then I will tell that to have a keyframe there. So you'll see now it will interpolate between that. If I put that down by frame 20, you'll see his legs start to break, but we would fix that if we were animating for real. We'll keyframe there, and then maybe at frame 30 we would move his foot back to here, and then maybe by frame 40 we would have it back up in the air and bent, and then maybe by frame 50 we would have it back to a sort of crossover pose. And then we would, I don't know why it keeps doing that, do that. We'd probably want that pose to be the same as the beginning, so I would copy that keyframe back to the beginning and paste it there. And then you'll see basically what would be sort of one, very robotic looking version of a run thing for that leg. More or less, that's the workflow. Obviously, that looks terrible, but what I was going to say is if you spend an hour with that more than 30 seconds, you can start to chain all of that together, and this is one of the run cycles that he has. It's basically that repeated on each leg. He does the sort of Naruto run with his hands behind him. And it's very slow because I gave that a lot of keyframes to be able to wiggle, but you could come in here and start to make that take longer and tell the clip to run at let's say playback scale of 0.5. So now he's going to run twice as fast, or if he's really got to go fast, you can go nuts with it and make the poor guy work. Last thing I was going to show, just as a silly example, who's a way better animator than me is motion capture. So what I was going to show in, let's see, if one wanted to, you can certainly use Blender to import any motion capture of your choice and have Dr. Garby here breaking it down for the good people. This is, I like to show exciting things, and this is a very easy way to get a great laugh with your model of choice. We've had King Donut dancing in the gazebo, all that sort of thing. So yeah, this is me downloading a free dance FBX and just tying it to Dr. Garbotnik. So yeah, that is me cutting at a good spot here with a few minutes to spare, just for any last questions or anything. I'm around. I would love to talk to people. My favorite would be if people want to talk at the VR portal and we can like show and tell all of the cool stuff that this gets used for over there. But yeah, I'm around. I'd be happy to do a questions in the hallway thing. Questions now?
So when you download a pre-made animation like this, is it rigged to a specific skeleton that you
Yes.
then have to
Yeah.
map to your model?
Yeah, the question was like, is this motion capture already rigged to a particular skeleton? And the answer is yes. Adobe has a free service called Mixamo if you just want to play with this. They're basically free motion capture libraries that you could, I mean, it's not just dance, it's like they'll have run and walk and swing a sword and all of that too. You can use those, and with whatever model you've made, there are basically things, this would be a YouTube video candidate for like crosswalking your model to match the skeleton of that thing to be able to just basically inherit that motion. Mixamo also has a character uploader where you can just give it a 3D model and it will rig it for you. Expect that not to come out perfectly, but like if you just want to kind of see it, like it's a good like, it's worth the 10 minutes to see your model moving more or less correctly to sort of visualize things, and then there you can spend the few hours to get it perfect. But yeah, that's yes is the answer, but with some flexibility, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you have to go deep into nodes to make big models, or can you just use basic like shape stuff?
Nodes, you're saying? Yeah. So there are different tools in Blender. Are you talking about like geometry nodes? Yeah. Yeah. So Blender in, I don't know how long, maybe the last like 3 years or so, has built in a tool called geometry nodes. It's one of those things that I think is like maybe the second, like when you've leveled up that first level and you're just comfortable with Blender, it's a great thing to play with. Think of it as like procedural modeling, where basically you can lay out like a visual graph of operations to make things happen step by step. So you might like start with a cube and have it like nodes that would extrude it or scale it and then move it to a particular location and apply materials, or like you're laying out basically a visual graph that will turn one thing into another thing. And it's great when you're like trying to make a procedural approach to a project. I would say definitely you don't need to do that. I feel like after many years of playing with it, I've really only played with it a little. But yeah, I mean, what I will say is it's sorcery when you watch somebody that has like completely automated something. And I think somebody that was starting fresh that like has that in mind might be more comfortable with it than me, who's been using it for 20 years and is like, what is this new thing? But yeah, yeah. Other questions? Yep.
Any advice for making weight painting less hell for complete newbie?
I will tell you, I don't want to discourage people, but very quietly, I hate weight painting. Weight painting is, just for anybody who doesn't know, basically when you attach vertices to a bone in an animation, like you're basically telling a model how much to be influenced by a particular bone and to what degree. And weight painting is the way of like visually telling it to like affect some areas of the model more than others. It's very tedious. But I don't know, I would say Blender has a couple of tools like using a gradient selection instead of painting vertex by vertex. Once I started like watching videos about how to really use those tools more gracefully, like I actually did start to hate it less. I would say the quick answer are look at the gradient tools and look at the smoothing operations, because it will take away those like jagged tears that you'll get where like the arm will move and then the body has like this cylinder connecting to the disconnected arm or whatever, yeah. But for what it's worth, I had to weight paint poor Dr. Garbotnik here for this FBX to not look terrible. I'm out of time, but yeah, anybody that wants to talk, I'll be out in the hall for a little while. And yeah, I hope everybody got something out of this.